Well, let's return to this Islamic State story. Reports in the Australian newspaper today of a secret ASIO mission to be conducted into Syria, clearing the way for families of Islamic State members to be repatriated to Australia. In total, 20 Australian women, more than 40 of their children, have been living in refugee camps in the northeast of Syria since the fall of the Islamic State Caliphate back in early 2019. Joining me now, someone who knows about this very intimately, former Home Affairs Minister, current Shadow Minister, Karen Andrews. Karen, I really appreciate your time. This is such an important issue. The idea to repatriate these women and children has been around since the end of the Caliphate. As Home Affairs Minister, you view this mission as high risk. Tell us why that was your view.
Well, hello, Peter. Look, I do view this entire scenario as high risk. From the mission's point of view, Syria is not a safe place for people to do, and I had serious reservations about sending Australian personnel in to conduct any sort of a mission to bring these people out of Syria. I certainly did not want to put them in harm's way. There's then a secondary issue, which is the prospect that these people have been radicalised. We know that some, if not all, of the women voluntarily went into Syria. They were very well aware of what they were required to do by ISIS and were carrying out the instructions of ISIS. So we know that there's a risk that they have been radicalised and continue to be radicalised. We don't know about the children at this stage. We don't know the age of the children, although that information would be held by the government and the intelligence agencies. So the first question is, how old are these children? How old are the male children? Because we know that there is a high risk of males becoming radicalised in the circumstances in which these children have found themselves. But as you've rightly said previously, Peter, women are also subject to being radicalised, and we know that the age at which people are becoming radicalised, so children, are getting younger and younger. So we're talking early teens. So I was concerned about how radicalised these people were. If they had been radicalised at all, they certainly would have been most unlikely to have gone through any de-radicalisation programs in Syria, which meant that it was high risk in those people coming to Australia. And of course, should they get here, then they will most likely to be subject to control orders, but that's a matter for the courts to determine whether or not there'll be a control order put in place and what the terms of that order will be. But it will be the Australian Federal Police and potentially state and territory police forces that will have the responsibility of making sure that these people are closely monitored and supervised, potentially for the rest of their natural lives. And that is an enormous cost to the taxpayer. So it's high risk to go in there to get them out. There's a high risk that they will be radicalised. There's a high risk that the de-radicalisation programs won't work. And they are a risk to the Australian community as well as a significant cost.
So let me just jump in there, because I think it's important that people at home understand that right now in Australia we have a number of people on control orders. It's not often talked about. As recently as last year, we had about 70 serious terrorists, going back 2 decades, about to have their terms in prison come up for review. I know the government at the time was trying to keep as many in prison, but you often don't have control over that. You're right to make the point that it's up to the courts. The legislation might be there about control orders, but the courts can somehow oftentimes be weaker than governments are on some of these issues. The cost, we knew a recent case in New Zealand where someone who was under active surveillance moved forward with a terror attack. So these are some of the challenges, aren't they, Karen? And the fact that the government had this in the papers today, or the Australian got hold of it, makes me think this could well be happening, the repatriation, as you and I are talking tonight about this. Have you had a briefing? Have you sought a briefing on where this is actually up to?
Look, I haven't had a briefing and there has been no outreach from any member of the government to make sure that I or the opposition was informed. I have written to the Minister for Home Affairs today and asked for a briefing that has gone from my office directly through to the Minister's office. Haven't heard a response, but we know that the Minister for Home Affairs is quite tardy in responding to things anyway, so it may be some time before we hear. We'll continue to pursue that. But there would be a number of issues that I would like to raise directly that go to the concerns that I have that we had when we were in government about the risks of repatriating these people, bringing them to Australia.
Let me play a clip for my audience from a private security expert, Neil Fergus, who was in the media this morning discussing some of the challenges there is for Australians on the ground in Syria. Have a listen.
There was some credible intelligence that a plot was being hatched to actually lure Australian government officials into that environment with the purpose of either killing them or holding them as hostage. So that would have impacted government risk assessments at that time.
So this is a reality of some of the issues you were dealing with.
Absolutely, and that was the risk that our personnel would have been under in going into Syria was one of the reasons that I was very much opposed in my time as Home Affairs Minister to sending them in there to conduct any such mission to bring these people out of Syria. And that's quite aside from the risk that they would pose to the Australian people.
Just quickly, Karen, I mean, I touched on the issue of de-radicalisation programs. I know when I was there in Canberra, there was literally millions of dollars being spent on these programs. The reports I read here and out of the UK in particular show there was limited value in these programs. We know in the case of the children, you touched on it before, we don't know their ages, but we had children, the cubs of the caliphate, they called them, young children involved in pretty brutal beheadings, I mean, pretty brutal terror acts there in the caliphate. These are some of the concerns. I mean, longer term, do you think you can turn around these people?
Look, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that you can de-radicalise people successfully. In fact, there's way more examples of people who have continued to conduct terrorist offences, including a couple in the UK in the last couple of years. So we know that it is so high risk for these people once they have been radicalised. And we know that at least some of the people have been radicalised that are in the Syrian camps now. And that's why it is such an enormous risk to contemplate bringing these people here to Australia. And I'm not only disappointed, I'm alarmed that the Labor government would be contemplating this seriously. Now, I don't know how much information the government has deliberately let out to media outlets, but it seems that there's an extraordinary amount of information that's in the public domain at this point in time. There's certainly been no denial there's been a tacit agreement, it would seem, from the federal government that work is underfoot because they're saying they can't comment further because of the sensitive nature of the operation. So it's concerning.
Well, Karen Andrews, I think it is such a good move by Peter Dutton that he did not move you from the portfolio where you have all of this history, because the government knows you know almost as much as they do, and it's incredibly important that you're speaking up on this issue. Thank you for your time tonight. This is why I don't like when ministers get moved around when they go into opposition, because you lose this corporate memory, and that's a case in point.